Jeremy was staring at his pa across the table, waiting for him to say something. Ma had been carrying a cast-iron frying pan full of scrambled eggs, but was presently frozen in time, pending her husband's reaction. Pa, or George Suttle, as most people called him, quietly took a sip of black coffee as he mulled over his son's announcement to the family that he'd be attending the Space Engineer College next month. The frying pan began to slowly weigh down Ma's arms as gravity slowly defeated her. Jeremy's little brother and sister chewed silently.
"That's fine,"
Pa said suddenly, setting his coffee down. The world seemed to unpause as scrambled eggs were scrapped onto their plates, and Ma said that the biscuits and gravy would be done soon.
"I know times are tough right now, Pa, that you need me to help around the farm, but—"
"Son, let me tell you something,"
his stern voice interrupted.
"You're 18 years old, and you think you've got it all figured out. Hell, I did when I was 18, and there wasn't a man alive who could have told otherwise. Now you go to this school. Just remember two things. I didn't raise no quitter, and we'll always love you."
"Thanks, Pa."
Jeremy woke with his alarm and forced his legs to swing out of bed and rest on the cool metal floor. A moment later, he jarred himself back awake and scrubbed his face with his hands to try and get his consciousness out of bed and join the rest of him. He held onto the empty top bunk and slowly stood, knowing that he'd be a little dizzy. He stretched slowly, and the soreness in his muscles reminded him of the work he'd done in the last 2 days. It was the last day of dry dock, and while he would have liked at least a week, Sella insisted that they couldn't wait that long. So he had gotten done everything he absolutely had to at dock, and would EVA for the rest. He slipped his boots on and made his way to the kitchen. When he had first came on board, the ship was a ghost town, but little by little he had met the 7 other crew members. He ground some coffee beans and slowly poured some boiling water through the strainer. He silently wished for a $10 Mr. Coffee, but this is what he currently had. He snagged a piece of breakfast bread and sat at the table. The others were buzzing with conversation, excited to be finally on their way. Jeremy blankly stared off, chewing his bread and pouring coffee into his mouth to try and get his higher brain functions going. The bread had pretty much everything his body would need to get going. Someone at school told him it was like the loaf they served prison inmates back on Earth, but he didn't mind it at all. It sort of reminded him of grits with syrup, but without the texture. The buzz stopped, jarring him out of his daze. He looked around and saw Sella standing in the hatchway. Gone was the pleasant demeanor in which they had met. Her wings were neatly tucked and clasped behind her, and she was dressed for business, not quite a uniform, since they all wore whatever. But it looked sharp and gave her an air of authority. She also carried herself like he'd expect a captain to.
"Jeremy Suttle, are we on schedule?"
she asked.
"Yes, I'll have the secondary fuel intake port done in 2 hours and the ventral cargo door in another 2,
he said, realizing he was quite awake now.
"So we'll be able to launch in 5?
Sella asked.
3 if I luck out with the cargo door and the gears are only misaligned.
4 hours, then,"
she said, stepping back through the hatchway. He choked down his bread and was pretty sure he gave himself first-degree burns when he slammed his coffee. But he didn't want to disappoint. He was getting up when a fuzzy hand grabbed his arm. Ari was a Marth, which to him looked nearly identical to a stuffed teddy bear. He had mused with the idea of smuggling Ari back home and tossing him into a bin full of toy bears at a department store just to get a kick out of scaring people. Ari was appalled by the idea.
"You're pushing yourself too hard,"
Ari said.
"I'm fine,"
Jeremy replied.
"No, look.
Ari insisted, pushing his medic tablet in front of him.
Your pain levels have been steadily rising, and your muscles are burned from some kind of acid inside you."
"I'm a little sore. I took some ibuprofen earlier. I'll be fine. Besides, today should be a short day."
Ari shook his head.
"How are you not bedridden?"
Jeremy shrugged, which ironically hurt a little, but assured Ari that he'd be okay, then made his way down to the ventral cargo area. The dry dock was in microgravity, but was thankfully pressurized, The air mixture wasn't ideal for humans, with oxygen being at only 18%, but Jeremy was able to work with just a small supplemental tank and mask, the benefit being that if he was really going at it, he could crank up his oxygen a bit. He got the last screw off the access panel for the door's gearbox and stuck it to the magnet on his vest. Squinting because he was a little afraid of what he'd find, he pulled the panel. He sighed in relief. There was one gear with sheared teeth, but it was mostly an alignment issue.
Hey D, can you bring me the number 4 gear for this door?
He asked over his comm.
It's Burton Totten, and yes.
His earbuds squawked.
Burton, sorry, I'm trying.
He replied. A minute later, an airlock opened and D poked his head up with the gear in his hand. He went to throw it, but Jeremy stopped him.
No, dude, bring it here. We don't need that thing bouncing around the dock if I miss it.
D, another Pa'arthon, spread his wings and gave a gentle flap, propelling him toward Jeremy, who reached his arm out. D caught it, and Jeremy brought him in close.
Thanks,
he said, taking the gear. D stayed watching him work.
Are you really going to have this done soon?
Jeremy slid a spacer onto the axle and got the gear into place.
I'm nearly done. I just need to get the alignment right and we'll be set.
He was turning one of the alignment bolts when an unsettling feeling came over him. He turned and saw D staring at him.
What?
D shook his head.
I'm trying to figure out why Sela wanted a Terran. Sure, you're good at what you do, and you can work a lot longer, but we could have just as well hired a few Pa'arthons.
Jeremy suddenly became aware that D might not know what was in the cargo containers.
Couldn't tell you,
he said. Snorted.
Wait, is this about the war? Seriously?
He asked.
Oh, look, you can think.
That was before I was born, man. I don't have any problem with you,
Jeremy said, turning back to the alignment.
That may be, but I was around for it. So was Sela.
So what?
Jeremy said, turning the last bolt.
Your prejudice against Terrans?
Your powers of observation are simply amazing.
Fuck you, then, Jeremy wanted to say, but held his tongue. It was his 3rd day on the job, and he was still trying to figure out the crew dynamics and where he fit in. Instead, he changed the subject.
How'd you end up on the behemoth anyway?
D seemed to relax a little, and the tension eased somewhat.
Sela picked me up on Da'al, Pa'arth's second moon. I was just a deckhand back then.
Are you from one of the big houses like Sela?
D snorted a laugh.
No, I was born in the dirt. I was born in the lower canopies, not really the dirt.
I gotcha. Now you're first mate on what has to be the biggest freighter I've ever seen. How long ago was that?
About 80 years ago, just before the war started.
D said.
Hand me the panel?
Jeremy asked, reaching out. D handed it to him.
I'll let Sela know you're almost finished. Call me when you're ready to test.
Jeremy only had 2 screws in when he heard an electric whine.
Shit!
He yelled, pushing off the hull. Once he was a safe distance, he stabilized with the thrusters on his pack and watched the door open fully, then close.
Hey D, I wasn't ready yet, man. You could have squashed me,
he yelled.
What? I'm nowhere near the door controls,
D replied.
Well, someone is. Can you get down there and make sure nobody messes with them?
There was a sigh then.
Sure.
Jeremy got the last screw into place and jetted back to the airlock. The transition from microgravity to gravity felt weird, especially when it was sudden. One boot was on solid ground and the other wanted to float. It made him a little dizzy, but he figured he'd get used to it. Jeremy walked onto the bridge in more or less a rage, but slowed his roll to a sudden stop when he heard Sela arguing with D, who pointed right at Jeremy as he stepped into the room.
Whoa, what did I do?
Sela turned to him.
You said that Burton Totten actuated the cargo door when you were still outside. He's saying he didn't. Which is it?
It took a moment, then Jeremy realized his mistake.
I made a mistake in assuming D was at the controls. I don't know who was actually there.
Now the gravity of that mistake was starting to set in. He had forgotten that most Xenos were quite literal when inferring accusations. In fact, it's what had started the war. By essentially accusing D of trying to kill him, then Sela stepping up for him, then his recanting statement just now, he had made her look foolish. Dee should have smirked or outright laughed at both of them, but instead he took a step back and began to excuse himself. Classy, Jeremy thought. Jeremy said,
I realize my mistake, Sella. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking clearly when I called Dee about the door. Someone did actuate the door, though. I checked the panel and there's no way it would have opened on its own.
Be careful with your words, Jeremy Subtle.
Dee said in a polite tone, then excused himself. There was silence on the bridge for what seemed like an hour after he left. Jeremy didn't dare move or speak. He found himself breathing as quietly as possible, actually. He had just stepped all over some toes and wasn't sure what was going to happen next.
Are we ready?
Sella asked.
Yes,
Jeremy replied, relaxing a little.
I've gotten everything done that had to be done in dry dock. I'll have to EVA for the rest once we're underway.
You're dismissed, Jeremy Subtle. Take the rest of the day off.
Jeremy escaped the bridge as quickly as he could. He was about to get a sigh of relief when he noticed Dee standing in the middle of the hall.
Shit, he muttered.
Yes, Jeremy Subtle, it appears you did step in some.
Did you just make a joke?
Dee tilted his head.
I think so.
Jeremy allowed himself a soft laugh.
You did the right thing admitting your mistake.
Dee said,
I only wish more Terrans would be willing to suffer humility like that. We may have never had that war.
Yeah, I know,
Jeremy said.
My pa always taught me to own your mistakes, to learn from them.
Pa?
My father.
He seems to be a wise man then.
Dee said. Jeremy nodded. A moment passed and Dee turned to leave, but stopped.
The view from the dorsal canopy is the best if you want to watch the launch.
When Jeremy entered the hydroponics chamber, it was pretty dark, but he could tell that the room was vast, if a little short. The ceiling was only about half a meter over his head. He was feeling around for a light switch when he realized he wasn't alone.
What are you doing in here?
A familiar voice asked.
Dee said I should watch the launch from up here.
There was a soft chirp, and the entire roof parted down the middle and began to slide apart, revealing the outside. He noticed Selah was standing in front of him, looking up as the doors locked into place on the outside of the hull.
Tatum has a sense of humor. Well, when you see him later, pretend I got angry and threatened to expose your insides if you came up here after my duty cycle.
Selah said. If she had been dressed for business before, she was all about relaxing now. Instead of the suit, she was in a large, puffy, and warm-looking robe that looked like it was made out of the most comfortable material imaginable.
Whoa,
Jeremy stammered.
He knows this is where I like to go after I work, and he knows I don't like being disturbed. You're fine. Here, sit.
She pointed to a makeshift bench. Jeremy sat, taking in his surroundings, now that they were illuminated by the station lights. The entire deck was essentially a garden, complete with wide bonsai trees and even a small creek. Selah sat next to him, seeming to quietly decompress. They sat there for a few minutes when a thought occurred to him.
I do have a question, if you don't mind.
Hmm?
How exactly did you see Star Wars when it debuted? That was in the 1970s, I think, and I'm not sure we even had satellites for television back then.
He was watching the massive doors of the dry dock begin to open, revealing the brightly dotted black field behind them, but he swore he heard her smile.
The Federation has been watching Terra for a while. They tend to investigate races with nuclear weapons and spacefaring capabilities. There were thousands of probes, probably still are. Monitoring was contracted out to many people. My house was one of them.
He turned.
Yeah, but you can't really see into a movie theater.
She did, in fact, smile that time.
I think drive-in theaters were before your time then.
A what?
You've never heard of a drive-in?
No, I mean, I get it, but...
Selah laughed.
You'd all get in your cars, you see, and it was basically a parking lot. There were these speakers you put in your car, or you could use your radio to listen to the movie. That's how we got the audio. There was this place where you could get food and drinks in the back, and you could just sit there with someone and comfortably watch a movie together.
He thought for a minute.
Oh, wow. So you'd never have to worry about people talking through the movie. That sounds nice.
Among other reasons, yes.
She said, turning back to watch the launch. Jeremy felt like he was missing something, but then the dry dock doors opened, and an ever-so-slight jolt ran through the behemoth as the docking clamps released them into the night.